This is a crash course to show how to integrate GPT-4 and GPT 3.5 and its latest chat API into your next website, application, or software. It allows you to perform and customize your own chat directly with OpenAI and its models. I'll show you how to build and deploy an application coded from scratch using serverless technology on Microsoft Azure, and it'll interface directly with OpenAI and its APIs. As this is beginner friendly, I'll make no assumptions and cover everything that you'll need. Let's begin.
I'm happy to say that this video was sponsored by none other than Microsoft. More on that later. Let's begin with OpenAI. Head to Google, search OpenAI, or just go to openai.com. First, you'll need an account. Select Products and Overview from the top menu, then select Get Started from the call to action. Here you can sign in with your existing account, or sign in with Google, or create a brand new account. Here you'll be taken to the OpenAI dashboard, and there's a few things that you can do here. Firstly, you have documentation, which is great to understand how OpenAI and its models work. There's also the API reference, which we'll be using as part of setting up this video. There's examples you can see where OpenAI have implemented their own features, and you can also go to the playground where you can interact with the chat version of GPT as well as GPT-4 and test out how it works to make sure that your idea can work before you build it out. While I don't have access to it just yet, the documentation is exactly the same for 3.5 as it is for 4. Now we'll need some software before we get started. I'll download NodeJS. This is a JavaScript runtime and it'll allow me to create a simple REST server. I'll be using version 18.15.0 LTS, and I'm just going to go through the prompts to install it. I'm also going to be using VSCode from Microsoft. This is my favorite code editor, and it comes with lots of great plugins that we can use to make the coding experience easier. Once you've installed and launched it, go to File and Open Folder. Create a new folder for this project. I'm going to call this GPT-4 ChatGPT 3.5 maybe Azure at the end, since I'll have this hosted on a serverless function later. I'm going to initialize the project. To do this, I'm going to run npm init in the terminal option on the bottom right. This will allow me to select a name for this project. I'm going to call it GPT4 API, and the rest I'm going to keep blank and just hit enter to set through. This will create a package.json file for me. I'm going to install a few packages for this. I'll run npm space install, and I'm going to install Express, OpenAI, Body Parser, and Cores. With these installed, we can create the very first file for the project, which will be just called index.js. Here, I'm going to import some of these modules that we've created. Firstly, I'll do OpenAI. I'll write the following: import with curly brackets configuration as well as OpenAI API from OpenAI. Next, I want to set up this configuration. I'm going to pass in const configuration equals new configuration as a class. And here I'm going to pass in and set two values, the organization as well as the API key. Finally, I'll initialize the configuration by calling const OpenAI equals new OpenAI API, passing in the configuration we've now set. I'm going to head over to the OpenAI website, and I'm going to head over to my account and view API keys. I'm going to select to create a new one, and I'm going to copy and paste that into the API section of VS Code. Then I'm also going to grab my organization ID. This is under settings, and it's just under organization ID. These are the two main things that you need as part of the new OpenAI module to get it initialized. It's time to query OpenAI. I'm going to query the chat model. To do this, I'm going to set a const value here called completion, and this will use async await. I'm going to equals await OpenAI dot create chat completion. This is one of the new options that is now available to interface with ChatGPT 3.5 as well as GPT-4. I'm going to set the model to start off with, and for this model I'm going to set it as GPT-3.5-Turbo, which is actually the cheaper model that is currently available. If you want to see more models, they're inside documentation and models. Here I've got GPT 3.5 and Turbo as well as GPT-4, and if you want to use any of these, simply copy paste the model name and place it in the prompt. Alright, let's jump back in. Then I'm going to set messages. This will be an array, and this array will have an object. It'll have two main values, role, which will start off as a user, and then content, which is the message itself, which I'll set to hello world to start off with. And that's pretty much it. Using this, I can now console log out the response. This for the completion models is completion.data.choices on index 0 and .message. This is a little bit different than other models. Now I can open up the terminal and test this out. I'm going to pass in node calling index.js. This won't work because I'm currently using an import statement, so I'll need to jump into package.jsons and pass in the value type, and this will equal module, and hit save on that package.json. This will allow me to use import statements, and I should now just be able to run the same query, which is node calling index.js. Now I'll get a response back from OpenAI, which says, "Hello, how can I assist you today?" Now it's time to add this to an actual web server so that we can access it on a browser. I'm going to import Express from Express as well as a few other libraries. These will include body parser as well as cores. Then I'm going to initialize Express. I'm going to pass in const app equals Express, and I'm also going to set a port being 3000. Here I'm going to use bodyparser.json as well as use cores, and I'm going to call app.get, so this will be a GET request, and this will be when the browser accesses that port. I'm going to paste in this as an async function so we can copy paste our completion in here, and I'm going to do a res.json and have a response as a JSON object here of the completion itself. Finally, I'm going to have the app listen on the port that we set earlier and console log out once it is listening. Now I can run this up in my terminal, so I'm going to call node run index.js, and then I'm going to access localhost 3000, and here is the response. Now I think it's time to make this interactive. I'm going to change this from a GET request to a POST request, and I'm going to listen for messages that get sent as part of that POST request. This message can be sent directly to the API inside of the array, and if you want, you could even collect messages as an array so that you have a backlog and history. Next, I'm going to create a front end so that we can actually push those messages across. I'm going to create a file called index.html, and then I'm going to head to Google to search for a basic HTML starter. There's one here from FreeCodeCamp, so I'm going to just scroll down and use this boilerplate and paste that straight into my own index.html file. I'm going to rename the title here to GPT-4 Chat API, and I'm also going to relabel the title here for the H1 block to ChatGPT4. I'll remove the script and start writing my own, but as part of that, I'll want to have a form that a user performs with an input and a submit button. The input will just be a text with the name message and the ID message, and the button will just be a submit button. Finally, I'll just have one additional div here, which will be the chat log, which is where all the messages will be. Now it's time to write the JavaScript for this so that we can start interacting with the web server we created earlier. I'm going to pass in const chatlog, which will actually reference the ID chatlog. I'm also going to pass in const message, which will reference the ID of messages. I'm going to pass in const form, which will be the form that we're submitting, and then I'm going to do an event listener on that form for any time it is submitted, and I'm going to run a function here, which will pass in e, and I'll do an e.preventDefault so it doesn't reload the page. Next, I'm going to pull out the text message from the input here from message.value, and I'm going to reset that message so that it's empty, so it looks like it's been submitted. And I'll do this by passing message.value to be blank. I'm going to create a new div element, and I'm going to call this the message element. It's going to create a div, and that div will have a class that says message and message sent. And then I'll configure what the inner HTML of that div is, which is the message text. And in there, I'll do the message text I'm sending to the server. Finally, I'll append that message to the chat log, and I'll scroll to the very top of the chat log so that you can see it. Now I'm going to do a fetch request, but this will be a post request to the web server on port 3000 on localhost. A few of the things I'll configure here is the method to be post, the headers, which will be application/JSON, and the body, which will be the message that the user has just done in their input. The response will be in JSON format. So what I'll do is a res.json to enable us to be able to view that. Then I'll use the data from that to create a new message element, which I'm going to append to the chat log. It's not just data.message, so I'm going to update the syntax for this. It's actually data.completion.content. And that's all, it's ready to go. I can now browse this file. I can browse it manually, just viewing index.html, but I also have Live Server running as a plugin, so here it is. And what I can do is type in a message like previously, hello world, click to send that. That'll query the web server and I've got the same response back. Unlike traditional OpenAI models, the chat completion allows you to have history. Let's actually add that in. The history is saved as an array of messages between the user and the assistant, with a system message being there at the start to give context to how the actual chatbot should work. What I'm going to do is add these in. Let's start off with a system message over here to basically describe what this assistant should be. In this case, I'm going to call it Design GPT, which will be a helpful assistant for graphics design as a chatbot. Next, I'm going to have a look at the syntax for the assistant and the user here. We want the front end to be using the same sort of messages and pass these off to the backend so that we have message history. This means, firstly, we need to get rid of this individual message we had in the past. I'm going to comment it out. I'm also going to pass in messages instead of a single message. And this array, I'm going to spread it out by deconstructing that array here into the messages section, and it will provide the history of everything that's happening from the front end. So let's jump into the front end now to actually pass that across. In order to do that, let's have a look at the schema, which needs it to have a role as well as content, and add these as part of our messages. I'm going to create a new value here. I'll call this value messages and pass in the schema from OpenAI's documentation. With an idea of how this looks, I can probably get rid of it. It's more or less there just as a placeholder right now as reference to know how the messages should be. With that though, once I create a new message from the form, I should create the schema for a object just like this. So here I'm going to create a new const value called new message, and this const value will have that schema. So let me paste that in. I'll get rid of that second object. I'll just have the user object in here. And instead of having content that was just already static, I'm going to put in the content that I get from that text input. So here I'll pass it in as a message text. Finally, I want this added to the messages array, so I'll do a simple messages.push with the new message being in there. Next, I'll update the message I'm sending to the server. Before it was the single message with the text, this time it'll be the messages array directly. The only thing I need to do now is to update the messages history when a response comes back from the server. So here I'm going to do new assistant message. I'm going to paste in that schema for the role being assistant this time. And I'm going to pass in data completions content since that's what we received back from the server and push that to the messages array. And that's it. Message history has been enabled. So let's actually restart the web server running node index.js and reload the front end here, just running a basic HTML file, and give it a test. I'll ask the system, hi, who are you? And the response is accurate. It's come back as Design GPT with the context we provided at the start. I now have message history, so if I include what can you do, it'll actually give me a good answer here based on the chat so far. All of this, however, is a local host, meaning you have to run it on your own computer. So next, I want to put this up online so that anyone can access. And this also means that if you're running any type of website, even on a platform or a mobile app, you'll be able to access this API. So what I'm going to do is put this up in the cloud, on the Microsoft Azure cloud to be specific. This only takes a few minutes, and I'm going to run you through the process. I've added an official Microsoft link to the description where you can access these files that I've built so far, as well as the Azure cloud to sign up, as well as some additional training resources if you need. Head to the link that says get started with Azure now, and here you'll be able to start with a free account. I'm going to select the button start free and go through the sign up process. Once complete, I'll be taken to the landing page here and I can head straight to the Azure portal. What I want to do is create a function that's going to run without any servers. While we could do this through the user interface, I'm going to do this inside of VSCode. What I'll do is head to extensions on the left menu and I'll search up Azure functions. There's a few different types of extensions here, but this one is the best for creating a serverless app. Once installed, on the left menu, you'll have a new option for Azure. The first thing I'll need to do is sign in to Azure. This is quite simple because there is a single sign-on. I can select the account I just created in Azure and use that to sign into the plugin. Once signed in, I'll have all the options available, including the one here to create a functions app. I'll be prompted to give it a unique name. I'll call it Adrian Azure GPT. I'll need to select a runtime, so I'll put it on NodeJS on version 18. I'll need a resource pool. I'll just select the default for US East. This will go on to deploy my app in Azure with my URL available just below. On the left-hand menu, the Functions app will now show Adrian Azure GPT. Now to create the workspace for this project, I'm going to go to Workspaces and I'm going to select the little lightning arrow, which basically creates a new project. You can select a folder for the project or the one we're already working in. You can also select a language. I'll be using JavaScript, and you can select a model. I'll be using the latest one, version 4. Finally, you select a trigger. I'm going to do a HTTP trigger, but you can also do time triggers and others. And finally, I'm going to give it a name. I'll give the name GPT function. What's cool is that the code along with the files are created for you. If I jump into the Files Explorer in VSCode, I can see my package.json, including my name for the project, as well as the function itself, GPT function. This includes a prompt here, which does a simple hello world, but I'm going to say hello Adrian as a test. I want to test this out locally, so I'm going to go back to Azure, I'm going to expand out the workplace, and I'm going to select Start Debugging. I'll connect this to my Azure storage, which was automatically created here, called Adrian Azure with some random number at the end, and this will start up the local instance of this project. In the terminal, I'll get the local address to connect to it, which is localhost 7071/API/GPT function. Let me try this out on the web browser. If I go to it, I can see that my hello Adrian is there. Now I'm going to close this project off by selecting disconnect. Since Azure actually connects straight to debugging inside of VS Code, it makes this whole process nice and easy. I want to now deploy this to the cloud. I have the option here next to the Thunderbolt as a cloud with an up arrow to deploy the workspace to the cloud. I'm going to deploy it to the Adrian Azure GPT functions app that I've created. I'll be prompted as well that I'll be overriding any existing deployments, and now it's running this deployment of the function. Once done, I can jump into Azure to take a look at it. Here is the Azure dashboard. I'm going to head over to Functions app. Here, I'm going to get a list of all my functions apps. I'm going to select the Adrian Azure GPT one. This will open up a side menu, and down here, I'll get the option for functions. I want to select that one to view the one I just deployed, and that should just be called the GPT function. I can select the GPT function to browse into it and grab the URL. Let me open this up in a Chrome window and make sure that it's actually loaded properly. And success, we've got hello Adrian. So now I can add OpenAI to this function. I'm going to install it first, running npm install OpenAI. And next, I'm going to make sure that it's in the package.json. It's the only library we need in this case. We're not going to be using Express, we'll just be using this function inside of Azure. I can jump back into my other file here for my Express server, and I can copy over the OpenAI configuration and initialization. I'm just going to paste it up here. I'm not using import statements here. I'm using require statements. So I'm going to change it to a const, and instead of a from, I'm going to send it to equals require, adding in the brackets around OpenAI. Next, I'm going to get rid of all the other syntax inside of this function. We don't need the context.log, which is kind of like console.log, and we don't need the name, which is queried from the URL. The response right now is just a string. I'm going to change it to a JSON body, and I'm going to get rid of the current content, then jump back into my Express file and copy over all the internal content that's happening inside of the post request. For this post request, I'm going to get rid of this res.json, but I'm going to copy over the completion that I want, as well as the response here from OpenAI, and I'm going to put this in a JSON object that gets sent back to the client. Finally, this is a post request on Azure, so it works a little bit different. Instead of rec.body, I'm going to call await request.json, and that pretty much does the exact same thing as requesting the body and the post data from there. And Azure also uses context.log instead of console.log, so I'll update that too. With all all this done, I can head to the debugger and test it out. I'm going to restart it. I'm going to just start up a new instance, and this will start it up on the same IP address I had before on localhost. But the one change I'll need to make is actually capturing this address itself, jumping back into my other VS Code for the front end, and changing the fetch request from localhost port 3000 to this one over here. Now let me test if it's working with my Azure function. I can test who are you, and I get a response back here saying that it's an AI chatbot, which means that we're now querying the Azure function, but it's still not in the cloud. So I'm going to head over to Azure, and this is the easiest part. I select the up arrow to deploy this function to the cloud, overriding the previous one I had. This uploads the entire project, including the new OpenAI module which I added, as well as the post request. So to test this, I'll grab the online URL for this function, and then I'm going to go to my front end and replace the localhost version here with the online version. This means that I can run this up pretty much anywhere. Let me test this out. If I do, can you access the internet? I unfortunately don't get a response because CORS isn't yet enabled on Azure. So let me do that right now. I'll jump back to Azure, head to the Functions app, select the function application here, and search up CORS. Here I'm going to select API CORS on the left hand side and select star to enable me to access it from anywhere. I'll hit save on that and let me try accessing this function once more. I'll select can you access the internet, and this time GPT comes back with yes it can. That's cool.
I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you liked it, you know what to do. Otherwise, I'd like to thank Microsoft for sponsoring this video as well. It was great to work with them, and if you want to learn more about them, the Azure Cloud, or this project in general, check out the link below as well.